Well, ain't this just a bitch? I knew the machine could send me through time. This is a whole new level of fucked up. I should have known something was wrong when the tech started scrambling. It's like flying, and you only freak out when the attendants get nervous, but still. Though I do have another question. What the fuck happened while I was gone? There I was, about to make an emergency jump to save another one of our own, and I look as the machine spins up and the techs start going absolutely crazy. I only got to see them for a few seconds, but one looked at me right before the jump and had this, oh crap, I'm sorry, look on his face. The next thing I know, I'm being flung through the air, clipping tree branches as I end up landing in a heap on the floor of some lightly forested area. Slowly getting myself up, I'm looking around, and there are no fields, no farmhouse, no sign of anything resembling human actions at all. I wanted to look around, but tending to my injuries kind of took first priority. Luckily, I didn't break anything, but I did have to clean up the laceration caused by the trees on the way down. It wasn't until I was up on my feet I was able to get a good look at my surroundings. It was fairly flat, with an old growth forest in every direction. Looking at the bark made me realize that these were massive oak trees, but I never would have expected them to grow so large. With the sun clearly going down, I knew I didn't have time to worry about it, so I picked a downhill direction and just started walking. The walk downhill was not easy with all the gear and, of course, a bunch of injuries, but before nightfall, I found my way to a small creek. I could see the weather was possibly coming in, so I knew I would have to set up for the night. Using some 550 parachute cord, I tied it to the pack on the other end of my belt, and then I used it to climb a tree. Normally, I would just build a temporary shelter on the ground, but since I didn't know where I was, it was kind of a bad idea to be on the ground. Also, it would have been nearly impossible to find enough wood to burn this late in the day. Since there's no point in taking chances, it was going to be a long night of sleeping in a tree. Once I found a good enough branch, at least 30 feet up, I hoisted the pack up to me and secured it to the limb. After making sure I was secured so that I would not be falling out of this tree at night, I sat and looked around at the horizon. Not being above the canopy made it difficult to see if there was anyone I could signal. I pulled out my cell phone and tried calling, but of course there was no signal. No signal and no connection made it for this whole boring night. Well, I would like to say that at least. Throughout the night, I could hear all sorts of things moving around and making noises. At one point, I was stirred awake by something moving around right under my location. I tried to be still as possible as to not allow it to know my exact location. Though, with the strafing, stiffing sounds, I had to look. What was below me made my heart drop out my ass and my blood run cold. In fact, I still wonder how I didn't soil myself at that very moment. What was under me, sniffing the tree as it circled the trunk, was the largest canine I had ever seen. The things were about as big as a frickin' horse. Not a pony, but a full-size horse, and broad, too. Its back was at least 4, maybe 5 feet across, with thick fur. That made it seem even bigger as it swayed in the light of the moon. I just looked at it as I just hoped it didn't look up. I didn't think it would jump high enough to get me, but the noise it could make might draw something that could. As silent as possible, I turned on one of my cameras and began to record it. The video, which I watched later, didn't do it really justice to the sheer scale of this thing. The size of the paws of this thing were about the size of a grizzly, if not bigger, and the head had to be more than 3 times the size of a microwave. As I sat there, all I could think was, don't move, don't breathe, don't even fart, as it sniffed around for about 45 minutes. Then it must have heard something as it darted off into the forest. From the forest came a very, very large animal. Due to its size, I couldn't see what it was. All I know is that it looked like the top of its head was even with the branch I was sitting on. I could only see it moving in shadow as it seemed to calmly walk through the forest about maybe 150 feet away from where I was. Suddenly, I wasn't thinking about needing a 50 caliber for the big dog, but I would need a rocket launcher to get out of this place alive. Hearing the branches snap as it moved reminded me of the German vehicles I worked with. They were so silent in their running that several tons of metal could only be heard by the breaking of the undergrowth as it moved through the training area. I took a very deep breath and of relief as it seemed to not notice me and just kept walking. It would be a sleepless night as I just listened to the sounds of the night, hoping to see the light of the next day. The night was full of unknown noises as the darkness seemed to get thicker and thicker. Finally, the first arrival of light allowed me to see my surroundings. Everything was quiet as the morning illuminated everything. After listening and watching for a while, I climbed down and got ready for a long walk. I had to walk since the retrieval beacon wasn't working. As I walked, I thought about what I had seen and tried to match it up with a fossil record. The big dog came up as direwolf, but there was nothing much to match the shadow I saw. I had to wonder, since direwolves died out centuries ago, when in the hell am I? They wouldn't send me to the past since that was against the rules. Could this be an alternate future? I didn't know, but shouldn't my retrieval beacon work in that case? Did it have something to do with that violent jump? I mean, it must have, but what? If this was the past, how is this all the vegetation current? I see all sorts of trees I recognize, but the terrain is new to me. Seriously, what the hell is going on? I followed the creek to a bigger one and then repeated the process until I got to a river. By this point, I was pretty tired of all the walking. I wanted to set up a camp and relax near the river, but after last night, I knew better. Turning to the river, I was about to try and top off my water until I saw the water itself begin to move. Now, you might think, oh well, it's a river, so water is constantly moving. But you'd be wrong. The water was rippling as though something was swimming under it. Now, I've never dealt with gators or crocodiles, but I know what it looks like when something is under the water. So I took off. I wasn't about to stand there and wait for some megafauna to make me its lunch. As I ran, trying desperately to get the recovery beacon to work, the damn thing would barely turn on enough to notice, and then my cell phone chimed, signaling that it was almost out of power. I would have cursed out loud if I wasn't running at full sprint up the damn hill. Once I got about 70 feet from the water's edge, I turned back to see the head rising out of the water. This head didn't stop when the eyes breached the water. Instead, the head kept rising up, showing this massive, long, muscular neck supporting it. This thing stared at me as the head raised about 10 feet from the water before the back of it was seen breaching the surface. The head was relatively smooth, while the rest of the body had long, wet hair matted on it. The black and extremely dirty hair was matted down like a moose when it gets out of the water. Its rounded back looked like a turtle's back without a shell, and its legs. Oh God, the legs. The legs started rising up and planting themselves on the bank of the river, one by one until all 6 of them were up, and it moved slowly in my direction, never breaking eye contact once. It must have thought I was paralyzed with fear because it calmly walked towards me, and once I was in position, it opened its mouth to show off its jagged and nearly serrated teeth. It positioned its head over me and came down slowly. I figured, that's enough video, and raised my rifle. After the recovery mission, I had before switched to 5.56mm rounds to the 7.62mm solid brass. The 4 shots rang out before this thing could react. It staggered back, shaking its head wildly from side to side. It moved with such force that I figured it was going to break its own neck. Then, as it staggered, it dropped down, laying flat on the ground. I waited for a few moments to make sure it wasn't moving before I moved in. Pulling out my materials from my bag, I made quick work of documenting and getting the samples I knew my employer wanted. Though I knew I couldn't stick around. I'd made one hell of a racket, plus the smell of a newly dead creature was going to bring all sorts of scavengers. Less than 5 minutes later, the shots were fired. I was gone. Running downstream, I knew I had to make some distance before another one of those things showed up. I wouldn't stop moving until my legs were about to give out. Plus, the sun was setting, and I had to find a place to hold up. Again, I climbed the biggest tree I could find, but this time I went a lot higher. Luckily for me, I was able to get a perch looking over the river. After securing my pack and myself to the tree, I looked through my gear and tried to figure out how to rig it to work. My phone was dead, and I would need sunlight to charge anything, any electronics, so that had to wait till tomorrow. The retrieval beacon was still not working right, but it looked like it was getting closer to full activation before suddenly shutting off. I guess I would have to wait until the next day to try it again. So all I could really do was eat one of my ration bars and let the night come in. Man, I wish I could get a fire going. The next night wasn't much better. Although I was able to get the night vision up on the big camera, I didn't see much at first. I'm guessing it was around 2200 to midnight before things got very interesting. Even though the noises were similar to the previous night, my unrestricted view gave me visuals that bombarded me with nightmare fuel. During the night, I could see those long neck things lifting their heads out of the water and moving up and down the river. It was peaceful until a couple of them just seemed to break out fighting. Though I didn't know what they were doing at first, it just looked like they were pushing each other back. That's until one of them lifted up one of its 6 legs and kicked the other on the back. From there, they both went medieval on each other. After a minute of kicking, clawing, biting, and shoving, a few others joined in, and it got real ugly and real messy. When it was all over, the original two were nothing more than bobbing bodies in the river as they drifted downstream with at least two other of these massive long-necked things. As it happened, the winner of the fight climbed out of the river and wailed loudly. I knew this was a show of dominance to the others. I chuckled softly and said, "Long live the king," watching several others join it on the shore. From there, the dominant male proceeded to mate with the females that joined it. One by one, and in full view of me, these things went through their dance. I'll spare you any further details, but I will say this. When you have to turn your head and say, "That's not right," at least 3 times during the process, you'd better have a strong stomach. When all of that was done, they went back into the water, and the night was once again quiet until I felt the tree move. I looked around, and at first I didn't see anything. Then my eyes found what was making the tree move. It was some sort of gigantic centipede, about 12 feet long, climbing the tree. I realized that it didn't know I was up here, so I waited until the thing got really close. I stuck the barrel of the rifle out, and the thing almost didn't take the bait. It stopped and it seemed to inspect the muzzle before feeling safe enough to continue. Just as the head began to crawl across the muzzle, I fired. At first, only the head snapped back from the shot ringing through the air. I was thinking I would have to put another shot into this one, and then, one by one, the legs began to give way, and the entire thing began to peel off the tree like a banana peel and landed with a sudden thump. As I placed the rifle back across my lap, I just started thinking the survival guys were right. You don't get much sleep at all when you have to survive by yourself. Even though I should have put it on sooner, I pulled out the suppressor and tightened it onto the end of the rifle. The next morning, I was more than extorted as I looked down at the dead centipede. To my shock, A pack of those direwolves were ripping this thing to pieces. The sounds of their claws crunching the carapace ran shivers up my spine. If they could that to an exoskeleton, then thinking of what they could do to the squishy human like me? Yikes. Once they finally left, I was able to get back down and I walked further downstream. It was about noon when I just had to stop. Out of a sheer whim, I reached for the retrieval beacon, and to my shock, it was turned on. I remember thanking God and hitting the emergency retrieval code. It was more than ready to go back. Looking back, I should have figured the techs had screwed something up royal, especially since a few seconds later I realized that this would just be the first of when and where I would see. Ugh, lucky me, huh?